Hi, I'm Emma Persky, and my background is not as a PayPal developer. In fact, I haven't really done much PayPal stuff until a few months ago. Certainly, my last experiences with it were for quite a while ago. And one thing that I realized when I started looking again at PayPal was that sometimes it's really hard to break into a whole new area of work, because everyone that's telling you information is really experienced. You're learning from the experts. But the thing is, sometimes you want to learn from someone who maybe isn't an expert and just can share their experiences of what it was like picking up something for the first time. And so that's pretty much what this talk is about. I restarted my PayPal experience probably 5 or 6 months ago when I had an idea for an application in the mobile space. With the mobile checkout API for iPhone, and I thought, great, I'll jump in there and I'll write this new application, and I'll become super rich and famous, and it'll be great. Of course, it's never quite as easy as that, and I'm neither super rich nor famous right now, but we're working on that. So this talk is primarily a walkthrough of the experiences that I had picking up the PayPal platform effectively for the first time, and how that interacted with the other things that I had experience of. And I'll take a little look at some of the problems that I end up banging my head against the wall over as we go on. So the last time I really used the PayPal platform was probably 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. Before I went to college, I was probably 16 or 17, and it was really about the express checkout, putting together really simple websites. Oh, I've got like a little PHP basket or something, and passing the details across to PayPal, getting back a transaction passed, a transaction failed, and really not having to do very much work, sort of almost a copy and paste with a code job. And that was a great experience. It was really easy to do that. And obviously, now that PayPal has become significantly more advanced, there are some incredible things you can do, some of which are very, very easy. And I think Express Checkouts is probably the greatest example of that. It's almost like a drag and drop type thing. But the idea that I had wasn't really for a website, it was for a mobile application. And that's where things start to get a little bit more complicated. So it all started with an idea. I was at a PayPal event in London where I used to live, and someone mentioned that there was going to be a mobile checkout API that was native to the iPhone. So instead of doing the traditional iPhone iTunes checkout within an application, you'd be able to actually make PayPal transactions inside your application. And I thought this was probably one of the coolest things that I'd ever heard of, because all of a sudden you could turn these iPhone applications into real business models. Because until then, your business model might have come from advertising or from selling your application, but you couldn't really run a real business inside the mobile space. And so this was really, in my mind, was going to revolutionize everything. And so I was very excited to pick this platform up and try working with it. And so I had this crazy idea that I'd be able to sell domain names through an iPhone application. And I'd be out there in a pub with my friends, and we'd have a couple of pints, and then we'd suddenly think, oh my God, the best domain name ever is imustdrinkmorebeer.com. I must register it right now. And we've all been there. We've all thought, I've got to get that domain name. This is the perfect application. And so I thought, great, I'll go ahead and build this application. And I'm a software engineer. I have a background in building fairly complex systems for network analysis, and also doing a lot of web development. And so I thought, it's fine. I should be able to pick all this stuff up easily, no problem. I'll write an application in a weekend. Of course, I hadn't done any PayPal work for 7 or 8 years, and I'd never built an iPhone application. And so I was pretty much setting myself up to fail at the first hurdle. All of a sudden, I was a noob again. I knew nothing about these platforms. I didn't know anything about, where do I find out if a transaction has passed? How do I get a notification that someone's payment was successful or unsuccessful? How can I pass payments on to my upstream suppliers? How can I even simply build a basic iPhone application? Nothing there. I had no experience of any of these things. And so it was kind of like going back to picking up programming for the first time, because everything was new. And building applications on unknown platforms is really hard. And it's especially hard when you have two platforms. You've got your PayPal platform and you've got your mobile platform, and all of a sudden you have these two wildly different and reasonably complex domains that you have to understand fully to build a full application. And so I pretty much had to go back to first principles. So what I did was start learning firstly about PayPal. What APIs were there? What information could I get about transactions? How do you process transactions? What does it mean? What are the different statuses of a transaction? Failed, confirmed, verified, all of these different semantics that encapsulate the language that we use to talk about PayPal transactions. Everything was new. And so I set off and I hit x.com and I went to a couple of PayPal developer events in the UK and started picking these things up slowly. But it's complicated because you don't know exactly where to start, and I didn't know exactly which bit of information I needed to know about. And I did the same thing with iPhone stuff. Instead of trying to build this entire application as the first iPhone application that I built, I went away and I learned a little bit about building a Hello World application, and then I progressed that to building maybe something a little bit more complex with some forms, and then I started integrating that with the other bits of knowledge that I had. And so there are all these things that we need to learn about, and like I say, the set of PayPal APIs is huge. There are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different requests that you can make against the various APIs in all sorts of different forms. Some are web-based, some are mobile-based, some only happen through the website, and they all have very different linguistics and semantics about how they work. And you really have to understand what it is that you want to do, and what is available in order to achieve your goals. And that's it's an interesting problem to try and tackle, especially if you've never tried it before. And so these are some of the APIs that, in my mind, are the core ones that you need to look at when building an application. There are the other ones that exist. There's lots about reporting and so on. Probably not relevant in the very first instance. But knowing things about express checkout if you're building a website, that's great because obviously that's how you can integrate really easily to do e-commerce on your site. Adaptive payments is the cool new technology that I think came out about a year and a bit ago, which allows you to do fantastic things like chaining payments, collecting money and only charging when you reach certain goals, distributing money to different people, and all sorts of things. Instant payment notifications. This is a pretty cool one. Obviously, you want to know when you've been paid, and if you don't necessarily have a stateful application or an application that returns and then gives you information, getting an IPN to your server is pretty cool because you can find out, this transaction got paid, I can ship this or I can buy that or do whatever it is that you need to do. And then mobile checkout obviously allows you to do mobile checkout on devices. So right now, iPhone and Android, which for me was the catalyst to picking up PayPal again. And the final API that I think is really useful in most beginner level applications is the transaction information. It's pretty critical that you can jump back in and find out what transactions you did at some point. You might lose state in your application. It might crash. You might need to do some reporting. But to take the transaction IDs and head back in and say, did this one pass? Did this one fail? Who does this ship to? Where does it go? So the transaction information is pretty critical. So these are just a small set of what's actually available, but the ones that I think are if you're picking up PayPal for the first time, take a look at the documentation about these specific APIs. That's the critical thing. So there are, like I say, many more beside this. And if you go to x.com and on one of the little nav bars at the top, you'll get a drop down of which gives you more drop downs and more drop downs that allows you to access into all of the different APIs, lots and lots and lots. So where do you really start when deciding to build an application that's going to integrate PayPal in some way? What's the first thing you do after you have this crazy wild idea while you're in a pub somewhere? So the first thing to do in my mind is to start prototyping. And there's lots of reasons for this, but the first one is because you need to put something down before you can understand what limitations you'll have. And I'll come back to the limitations later on. But start by building little bits of your application. Start by experimenting with how PayPal works. So build a simple tool that does something like passing some transaction information from maybe your mobile phone to the back end, and maybe write a little bit that takes a transaction ID and checks it against the notifications API. But build these little bits of functionality in isolation. And by building those, you'll start to understand how it is that they will all fit together. As you start to build these individual components and have each one working correctly, you'll be able to gain an understanding of how they interact with each other. And then when you go to finally put everything together, it will become so much clearer to you. So specifically in my case of building an iPhone application, I had three different aspects. I had the actual application on the iPhone itself. I had that was my custom code, my native bits to tell you about how you're going to buy your domain name, maybe some suggestions, whatever it was. I had the PayPal aspect of my iPhone application of integrating with PayPal's APIs, sending stuff off to get processed, getting return information, and plugging that in together. And the third half, if you will, of the application was the server-side component of my application. So once someone bought a domain name on their iPhone, I'd have to make sure a notification got sent to my server so that I can go and action I can make some records and action the actual purchasing of that domain name automatically. So you've got to bring these three bits together. And if you work on them in isolation and understand each of those little problem domains as they are, it'll become much easier to bring them together in the long run. And this is the critical thing. It allows you to start exploring the limitations. Each API obviously has its limitations. They are very wide-ranging, but they don't all work in exactly the same way, and they don't all provide all the features that you want. And that's not just true of PayPal's APIs. That's true of everything out there. Everything has its limitations. And unless you start prototyping and really understanding, A, how your application is going to work, and B, how you're going to leverage the PayPal APIs, you'll never get to the point to understanding those limitations, because you can read all the documentation you want. You might have read book after book after book after white paper and hundreds of pages on x.com. But until you actually try to do something, it's very difficult to understand what it is that you can't do. So that might be as simple as firing up, if you're using some Ruby, to firing up an IRB console, or if you're doing PHP, writing a little PHP script that doesn't have any bells or whistles. It doesn't look great. It's just something for you to try and explore what the possibilities are. So for me, this is the thing. It allows you to understand your problem domain, and then you can understand the techniques you can use to solve that problem. So one of the key problems that I had when building my application was that mobile checkout for iPhone has no basket included. So it doesn't have a multi-line basket. You can buy a single item using your iPhone, and you have to encapsulate all of the information about that item into a single line and then process that transaction. Well, that's great if, like the developer docs say, you're buying a pizza. I just want one pizza, and you're by yourself and you want one pizza. But if you're buying 3 or 4 pizzas and they've all got different toppings, and or you might be selling domain names and you need to know if someone wants the .co.uk and the .com, not the .net, and so on and so forth, you need to be able to encapsulate all of that information. And so my first instance against this, we'll find a way to concatenate all of that information to a single line. Of course, once you start working with that and looking into it, you realize that line has a limitation in the number of characters that you can have in there. And I don't off the top of my head know how many characters that is, and it's big, but it's not big enough to encapsulate every possible outcome of your application. So I had to start working out how it was that I could work around this limitation, because that was pretty critical for me. I should allow people to buy what it was that they wanted exactly and with no limitations. So I had to figure out how to compress my entire basket into a single line item. And the methodology I used was something like this. And this is very relevant to mobile stuff. Obviously, different platforms have different limitations. But certainly with the iPhone mobile checkout, was to take all of the information from the application about the products and services that I was selling, send those off to the server over some RESTful or non-RESTful service, capture that information on the server in a server-side basket. So all of a sudden, I've got a basket on my iPhone, and I've got a basket on my server, and they're synced up. So every time you add an item, I might send it off. Or it might be that when I finally collected my entire basket on my iPhone, I send it off to the server and make sure it's the same. And I would send back a basket ID. And I would then use that basket ID as the single line item in the PayPal checkout API. And that way I could check out, I could send to PayPal for that basket to be bought. I could make sure that the transaction came back with the right amount of money that I had to charge, and then I could forward the confirmation back to my server and say, okay, well, this is the transaction or the basket that was bought. Unpack all of the information about what was in that basket and actually process those things one at a time. So effectively wrapping PayPal in my own little transaction layer. And this, it doesn't need to be any complex transaction level locking or anything like that. It's simply saying that, well, there is this thing that exists that's wider than PayPal. It's my application information, the basket that I'm selling. And you collect that information, pass over what you need to PayPal, and get back what you need. Minimize that information, because that, obviously, anything that you're passing over to PayPal is limited in what you can pass. So this is a simple, very, very high level example of a shoe application that I came up with the other day. So you might building this application that allows people to buy some shoes on their iPhone, because we all want to buy shoes while we're out and about. And so the first thing that you have to think of is, great, okay, well, I'm building a mobile application. This isn't on the web. This isn't all being generated. The view isn't being generated on the server and then pushed down to the iPhone. This is a native application. So the first thing I have to do is make sure that the products I'm selling are at the right price, because things change on a day-to-day basis. So we head off to the server when the application is loaded and get the current price of shoes so that we can populate our list. We then have a way of selecting all of the different shoes that we want to buy, popping them into an array perhaps on the iPhone application, and passing all of that information back to the shoe server, and that becomes our basket or our own transaction. Once we have that information, we fire off to PayPal and say, great, I'd like to buy this basket. And we might include in the text about that transaction that I wanted to buy the red shoes and the blue shoes. I didn't want to buy the back shoes. They were only $45. They weren't that cool. So I go off to PayPal, and the little PayPal window pops up in your mobile application. And your customer does their transaction. They put in their account details. They click OK. They've got the funds. It's all great. And you get a notification back to your application that says, great, this customer succeeded in the transaction. You can go off and sell those shoes. And it's kind of cool that you're able to do that. But all of a sudden, that piece of information exists solely on the iPhone. Your server has no interaction with PayPal at this point. So, okay, my iPhone knows that my customer's iPhone knows that I should ship some shoes to them. It's difficult to say. Ship some shoes to them. But I don't know that. My entire business model has no idea that transaction passed. So I was saying before about instant payment notifications. That's one way that allows us to solve that problem. We could set up an instance so that whenever we get a transaction that's successful, we fire off an IPN to our server. Or we could have the iPhone application actually pass the transaction ID back to the server. And that's actually what I decided to do, because I found that instant payment notifications weren't quite as instant as I wanted them to be. And in something like buying domain names, it's pretty critical that you have that processed as soon as possible, because obviously it's time sensitive. Once someone else has registered the domain name, you're stuck. So even like a 5 or 10 minute delay in an instant payment notification could be a problem. So I passed the PayPal transaction ID back to my server, where I used the transaction information API to pull out the information about that transaction. And now I could verify that the amount of money that that the transaction was for was the same amount that I thought the basket should be charged at. I could pull out all of the information about that transaction, which domains they should be registering, or we should be registering, and which additional services should be sold, and all of that complex application domain information that was stored within the basket that was not stored within the PayPal transaction. And so that's sort of my overall transaction of how I integrated with PayPal by using that transaction ID and pulling data out using the transaction information API. And so once I'd gone off and registered those domain names using my server, I could pass a message back to the client application saying, great, you've registered this domain name, now go off and build your awesome new application. So problems like that and understanding how an entire application stack fits together are not things that we can solve in 5 minutes. These are things that we need to think about, and this is simply one example of an architecture that you could use to build a PayPal application. There are many different ways of solving these problems, and maybe at some point PayPal will build on the iPhone API to allow you to have multiple line items. They certainly hadn't when I looked last a couple of months ago. So that might change. It might no longer be relevant that you need to wrap these things in your own transactions. But I have no doubt that other problems will crop up. And effectively, what I'm really getting at is that we have to understand the resources that are out there and the limitations that they have. And the best way to do that is to actually start implementing things. And it kind of follows the agile, release early, release often methodology of rather than writing out hundreds and hundreds of specifications about how your application should work and this is exactly the process that should happen and this is the end-to-end wireframe and this is the specifications and this is what it should look like. We don't have to worry about that. We should start building it and figure out to an extent where we go along. Of course, we need to always maintain our overall goal in our mind and maybe on paper if we're working with clients of where we want to go. But ultimately, until we become experts in these fields, until we've worked with all of the APIs that we might use a couple of times, we won't understand what a lot of the limitations are. And so doing this following an agile methodology where you're constantly exploring and constantly challenging yourself to write new code allows us to understand how the APIs work and where we can go with them. So there was a lot of head banging in all of this process. Frequently I would think I'd solved some problem and then I would end up going, why doesn't it work? I think one of the greatest examples I had was right at the very beginning, and this was, I think, within a matter of a week of the mobile checkout API being formally launched, coming out of beta. I saw it had come up there and I downloaded it and I spent the week learning how to do iPhone dev and picking up some PayPal bits and pieces, and finally it was like, great, now it's time to put it together. So I built a really, really simple application that just had a PayPal checkout button. So I checked out something and I checked through the sandbox that it had all been bought. That was great. And then I thought, okay, well, let's try it with another customer. So I deleted everything about my application from my computer, fired it up again, put in my second sandbox account, and it says, sorry, this sandbox account, what was the exact error message? This account, this device is linked to another account and you can't unlink it. You have to log in to unlink it. And of course, that doesn't really work with the sandbox account, with the sandbox system, because I'd already deleted that sandbox account and I could no longer log in and delete it. Now, this exact problem has been solved by now, and it's not a problem. But at the time, what was happening was that every time you logged in using PayPal, using a mobile device, it would store some kind of unique device ID in the server, and it would then tie the device and that account together. So you couldn't use a second device on the account, and that's great in the real world because that gives us a lot of protection and makes sure people aren't, doing naughty things with mobile devices. But that wasn't great in a sandbox environment where you need to be testing these things. And so my workaround was to open up the device unique ID class and actually provide a random string every time it requested it. And so every time PayPal's API said, oh, I need to get the device ID of this thing, it would produce a random 32-character string. I think it was 31 with a counter at the end, so it was new each time. And so I I encountered a problem like this, and I found a fairly naughty workaround. But the great thing about that is that I emailed the guys at DTS, Developer Technical Services, and said, hey, I'm doing this thing to work around a problem that you have. It's going to be filling your database up with all sorts of junk iPhone device IDs. I hope you don't mind. And I got an almost instant response saying, hey, that's a great workaround. Please don't tell anyone about this just yet, because we're going to solve this problem in the next few days. And it was solved very shortly afterwards. But it's good to know that kind of information. And so this is effectively the one of the great things about working with PayPal's APIs versus pretty much any other API that I've ever worked with. Because every time we use PayPal, we're generating revenue for them. There's obviously an incentive for them to put a lot of effort into helping us solve these problems. So Developer Technical Services is this awesome resource that's sometimes a little bit hard to find, especially when you're first-time developer to PayPal. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to find out, but it is there, and you can find it at paypal.com/DTS. And this is a huge bunch of technical people that know exactly how the APIs work. They know how the platforms that you have to deploy them on work. And if you head over to that address and you have a problem and you file a bug report, you'll have answers so quick. And it's really great. Never have I worked with an API in the past that I get such great responses from. And they're really helpful, and I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of people here today right now from DTS, or at least who have a good understanding how that works. And so I would strongly encourage anyone who has had any technical problems while you're here to go and talk to people and try and find out. There might be some technical limitation in the problem that you're having that means that you need to find a workaround. It might be that you're doing something in a slightly wrong way and you've misunderstood some documentation. And if you can't find someone here right now to solve your problem, head over to that web address and file a bug report, and you will get great support from them. And then also the forums, x.com, is a great resource as well. So a lot of the problems that you run up against when you're first building an application are actually problems that everyone has had. It's very, very unusual to come up with a completely unique problem. Certainly during the first couple of weeks of exploring a new API, because you're trying all the things that everyone has tried before. And the forums are a great resource. So if you search the forums, you'll probably find a lot of the answers that you're looking for. And then obviously if you don't, DTS is still there. And there's also the merchant technical support that's always there, kind of less relevant for us as developers. But if you're the kind of person that's building an application for yourself and you're trying to, make your fortune through PayPal, probably relevant once you start generating real transactions. So there's lots of help and resource available out there, and you should make as much use of it as possible because it really is a great resource. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. It's nothing technical or complex or advanced. I just wanted to share my experiences of what it was like to develop for PayPal for the first time, and knowing that there's lots of other people out there that have heard about the amazing things that you can do. Maybe you've seen an application that does something really cool, and you're like, I want to do something like that in my own space. How do I go and do it? And this is the kind of event that we come to try and ask those questions and understand how we do that. So that's pretty much what I've got for you. Does anyone have any questions? Hey.
So the lack of a basket, is that something you've talked to PayPal about adding to their library?
Do you guys need that question on the microphone? I think they might need you to so they can record it.
Yeah, the lack of a basket, is that something you've talked to them about adding to their library, and what kind of response did you get from them, them being PayPal, about that?
Sure. So I haven't spoken to anyone about that problem. It's probably, I would hope that it's something that PayPal would add to the library. I kind of developed it off in my own in isolation. And it was kind of relevant for the way that I solved it. I probably would have needed to solve it in that way anyway. I think it's especially relevant in a mobile platform that you need to maintain a very strict control over the transaction that's happening, because you don't want to end up in a situation where a customer thinks they've bought something but it hasn't actually been bought, or they've bought something and there's something that's gone wrong with the price somewhere, because you're dealing with this. Effectively, it's a device that you have no control over. You have to be very strict about building your own transaction around that. I didn't want to entrust to too much information going over the wire. I wanted the basket on my server, so that when it came back, I could say, well, these are the things that I think they've bought. This is what it costs. This is what PayPal have received from the third party. I can make sure they all add up. If you're selling something that's digital, I'm not sure you can do that with the mobile checkout API. But if, there are obviously some circumstances where that level of tight security is maybe not quite so relevant. It might be that you're not selling an instantaneous kind of service. You're it's like a pizza, for example, which is in the developer documentation. That would probably be a great thing to add to the service, and I can only imagine there are lots of brains sitting away in PayPal offices in I think in San Jose, working away trying to get that working. I certainly hope there are. There's a microphone coming for you.
Did you test on the emulator, and were there any differences you noticed when you ran on emulator and real device?
Yeah. So you asked about the differences between the sandbox and the live environment. Oh, sorry. In the simulator, on the simulator and the actual device. Okay. Well, so the reason I asked that is because there was a section that I've missed out on the slides about the difference between sandbox and live, but it's just as relevant between the differences between device and live. Also, device and simulator on your developing platform. So I haven't noticed anything particularly different. Again, that may have changed since I last. This was a couple of months ago. It was the last time I had a chance to work on this project. I've been as I think anyone who does development in their spare time, you go in waves. Sort of for a while, you might be not very busy at work, and you do lots of home development, and then suddenly work picks up, and you're like, I haven't got time to work on my personal projects. So I didn't actually. The first time I came across the difference was. What I thought was the difference was when I discovered this locking of an account to a device. So I was on my app, on my simulator, and I'd put in my test app account, great, all done, very nice, and then I picked it up on my device and tried to log in again. It was like, oh, it's locked. And after I got over that problem, I haven't noticed any environment. There seems to be a pretty stable thing across both, which was quite good. And in terms of the sandbox versus live, that's a different matter. There are lots of differences between the two. Things, even simple things like the speed of response from the sandbox. You might think, this application is running really slow. It's everything is taking forever. I don't know how I could launch this. And then you flip over to using the live, and suddenly everything's become snappy again. So there are lots of differences. It's probably out of scope here to explore that. But there are differences between live and sandbox that are fairly subtle that you do come up against. But yeah. Any other questions? No. Okay. Well. Yes. One more question.
You mentioned the instant notifications weren't that fast. What type of times were you seeing?
The longest one I've seen is something like 24 hours. That's unusual. And that may have been from a sandbox one. I can't remember. But it's sort of 5 or 10 minutes is not unheard of on a regular basis. Most of them come through fairly quickly. But if you're relying on I'm trying to think. I think the terms and conditions don't actually specify how quickly they'll deliver instant payment notifications to you, and so instant is for some value of. From my experience, it wasn't fast enough to rely on anything that was incredibly time sensitive. I mean, if you're building a share trading application, which is probably against the terms and conditions of PayPal, but if you were, you wouldn't want to rely on IPN to do it. But if it's an inventor item that's not going to go out of stock, IPN would be fine to do that.
You've thrown out some outliers, 5, 10 minutes, 24. What's typical, did you see?
Say again,
What's typical? On average, what did you see? Was it a minute?
I don't know.
Okay.
I've not. I was mostly looking at the outliers rather than the short time. I'm trying to think what it seems pretty quick normally. Like a minute seems like I don't often sit there for sort of 5 minutes and think, where is this? But I'm not measuring it in sort of shorter scales than that because it's during development. I'm doing 100 things at once.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? Yep, we have one at the front.
What kind of security considerations do you have when you're building your app?
I think they might want you to speak into the mic. Sorry, I should have.
I was just curious about the security considerations you might have needed to take while you were developing your app.
Sure. So, so in terms of actual transaction security and money, you really don't have to worry about anything because PayPal does that all for you. And if you haven't worked with the mobile payments API, what happens is once you you get a compiled bundle that you install into your repository, into your code base. And you make a call to that repository when it's relevant to head off to PayPal, and your application effectively loses control, and PayPal pops up in front of you. And it's not a separate application; it's all within application. But they've done some very clever low-level programming on the iPhone to take over your application, effectively. They go off and they process that transaction. It's all within their little secure space, and then you have a set of methods that you implement, which you have callbacks to that are like on success and on failure and on suspend, I think. So you don't have to worry about that side of it. Outside of that, depending on what you're selling, you might want to have obviously some over-the-wire encryption. So obviously, if it's on a mobile device and you're sending information to a server, if you're dealing with customer information, you probably want to encrypt that over HTTPS. I don't believe there's anything in PayPal's requirements that you actually do that because their transaction is the important secure bit. But I would feel, if in the README about my application or someone else's application that I knew that everything that was personal that was going over secure, I would be a lot more comfortable. And it's with a lot of these things, there are libraries that just it's a Boolean flag. You say yes, do this over secure, and it becomes secure. And sure, it might be marginally slower, but if you're going over a mobile data network, it's so insignificant that it's that. So what I ended up doing was just putting everything over HTTPS because the volume of data was so small, it was irrelevant. If on the other hand you are you're selling, I don't know, custom T-shirts. This is quite a cool idea. Maybe someone's done it. Custom T-shirts through your mobile phone. So it's like, I want to print this on a T-shirt. Snap with a photo, and then send my PayPal money. And you want to upload that photo. You probably wouldn't want to do that over HTTPS just because of the overhead. And you maybe encrypt the customer information and then not encrypt the photograph. So it's certainly with iPhone, it was very easy just to turn a Boolean flag and say do everything over secure, and then I don't really have to worry about it. And on the server side, obviously, you've got to match that. And then again, just encrypting anything that's vaguely sensitive in the database. Obviously, you don't have to worry with mobile checkout API about storing credit cards or too much personal information. And if you're not doing shipping, you really don't have to worry about that. So actually, that reminds me, that's probably the bit you really do want to do over secure. If you're selling a physical product and you ask your customers to put in a shipping address inside the checkout section of the mobile application, you receive that back and you'll have to send that to your server. So you probably want to do that over secure. I wouldn't want my home address going unencrypted over the wire somewhere. But yeah, so the security requirements are there. But they're not a burden. You don't have to worry. It's far easier than I thought it would be to deal with the security. Do we have another question over here?
I waited till you get back there before I raised my hand.
Sorry.
No, I was just kidding. Instant notification, you mentioned your experience was as long as 24 hours. Now, I'm not sure whether transaction information provides this or even any other notification that if you could do pooling information. Was that a possibility to see the status, and what kind of response you saw when you attempted that, if you did?
Right, so that's exactly how I solved the problem. So instead of waiting for the IPN, I didn't use IPN at all, after you get the callback to your mobile application from PayPal, you get a transaction ID. And the first thing I did was immediately send that back to my web server. And from the web server, you can make an instantaneous call to the notification, the transaction information API, and it was in there instantly. Like there was no time delay. I mean, I was probably within a second was the quickest that I could make the data go between the various different places and do the and check it, and it was always there. I never ran into occurrence that it wasn't in that. However, I do believe that within the terms and conditions that it's not necessarily instant, but I never experienced it not being so. And certainly you would probably have the transaction would be there, but it might have a payment status of pending instead of confirmed. So if you receive something like that, it's fairly trivial to say, okay, we'll come back and check this in an hour or whatever. But I've never seen it not be instant. So that was that's the transaction API. I think that's probably one of PayPal's oldest APIs. I remember that from when I last did work a couple of years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Cool. Well, I'll pop up the slides. Have I got PRSK? Yes. So I'll pop up my slide deck by the end of the week on emmapersky.com. If I can do that, I'm pretty sure I can. If I can't, I'll take all the information out and put it into a blog post if anyone wants to have a look at that. And if you do have any other questions or want to contact me, just my email address is up there, or you can get hold of me on Twitter, and I'm more than happy to help you. Thank you very much.